Hey guys, every now and then I like to talk about things that aren't completely related to Star Wars. I used to have a second channel known as Generation Films where I would talk about a lot of other things like my love for humanity and the many aquatic threats that humanity faces. But honestly, it was just way too much work handling two channels, so I decided to take a step back. But every now and then something pops out in the cultural zeitgeist that I really want to comment about, especially today's topic, which is managed democracy, which is the political system that comes from the very popular video game out right now called Helldivers 2. And why am I excited about this idea? Well, a long time ago, I started my own political movement known as Humanity First. This was a xenophobic organization that was focused on highlighting the brilliance of humanity and focused on stopping humans from killing and oppressing each other so we can finally join forces and oppress every other species in the galaxy. This has always been my humor because of the things I grew up with, Starship Troopers, all the crazy video games with Space Marines, and I think a lot of you were in on the joke. Some people weren't in on the joke, and I guess that is also the point of Humanity First. We live in a fast-paced world today where people are bombarded with information, and oftentimes people are told that things are bad without truly understanding why they are bad. Yes, xenophobia is terrible in most cases. It limits our opportunities to grow and expand our knowledge and connections with the wider world. Nations who have chosen isolation and gratuitous amounts of self-love in human history have always grown weak and collapsed. But isn't it kind of silly to be triggered by a bunch of adults on the internet who pretend to be racist against fictional aliens and also fictional sentient machine beings? Shouldn't we wait until we verify their existence before defending them or something? I don't know. Meanwhile, let us degenerates fulfill our childhood Halo, Doom, Warhammer 40k fantasies. I find that especially with certain men who might have grown up with combat sports or just violence in their lives, there's just something intoxicating about being able to let loose with your full strength and fury at someone. I also think a good percentage of society sees these individuals who need violence in their lives and are terrified of them, and I understand. But I assure you, these people are going to be harmless as long as they have a positive outlet for that energy. And I believe the people who made Helldivers 2, a Swedish company called Arrowhead Studios, I believe, really understands this part of the gamer demographic. And so when it became clear that Super Earth needed more Helldivers to defend our beloved managed democracy, I signed up with full enthusiasm and immediately soaked up the lore and was hooked by the tone and vibe of the game. For those of you in the know, I'm the combat controller guy who does not care about friendly casualties. I have the 500 kg bomb, I have the 120 millimeter artillery barrage, but I also carry the 380 with me just in case I need something bigger, and I usually ran it off with something else that blows up, cluster bombs or something. I mean, I love this game so much that I actually started hounding my editor to play it, until finally we were both getting dropped out of orbit in questionably constructed drop pods that hit the soil so hard that he actually goes several feet below the ground, which I'm sure causes like traumatic brain injury. And we did our parts. And even though it probably affected work on this YouTube channel, we helped manage the Terminid population to the point where they were no longer threatening Super Earth. We helped retake Malevolent Creek from the automatons, finally getting revenge for the countless Helldivers that fell. I mean, all throughout our journey as Helldivers, every mission success, every discovery actually changed how the game worked, which is really awesome. This is a really brilliant organic marketing strategy from the developers who really made the players feel like they were part of the game and the storytelling that was unfolding as we were playing. For instance, me and Congo were amongst the first wave to use mechs after the factories on Tianquan were able to restart production. We also found out in horror that the Terminids had evolved into a flying form. We were so sucked into the madness, the blood, the guts, the courage, and the overwhelming love for democracy, we forgot to ask one simple question. What the hell is managed democracy? Well, actually look this up. So in our own world, managed democracy is also known as a guided democracy. And this is a government system that has all the trappings of democracy, but is actually an authoritarian government. They're just going through the motions when it comes to elections and checks and balances. A good example of a guided democracy or a managed democracy would actually be the Galactic Republic during the end of the Clone Wars, and also the Separatist Alliance or Confederacy of Independent Systems. When the Emergency Powers Act was passed by the Galactic Senate in response to the Separatist crisis, it allowed Supreme Chancellor Palpatine to continue to rule the Republic. You see, he'd been elected in 32 BBY, and he was a well-liked leader, but the office of the Supreme Chancellor was limited to just 2 terms, and in 24 BBY, he was on his way out. until the Emergency Act. Palpatine convinced the Senate that in times of crisis like this, political change could be harmful for the country and the war effort. And so he was allowed to stay on in his position until the war was over. This kind of behavior would have really troubled constitutionalists in our own republic. For example, the United States in 1944, just months after the extremely audacious and risky invasion of Normandy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won his 4th presidential election. There were no term limits at the time, and even though the US was involved in the largest war in human history and had millions of troops deployed from Europe to Asia, elections were still held. And in 1864, with General Grant chasing Lee's forces into the heart of Virginia, Abraham Lincoln won his re-election. Even when the United States is involved in an existential crisis, we still have to go to the polls because of a series of amendments and rules in the Constitution, including Section 1 of the 20th Amendment, which states, "The term of the President and Vice President shall end at noon on the 20th day of January." Even a worldwide pandemic didn't change that. Now, it's not to say that Palpatine's Emergency Powers Act turned the Republic into a managed democracy overnight. Most government systems are hybrids in our world. There are no true democracies, there are no true authoritarian governments. Everything is kind of a mix. I would actually argue that Palpatine being granted temporary emergency powers, which is how the Senate saw it, is actually somewhat reasonable as far as political policies go, especially when you consider what was going on in the galaxy at the time. A gigantic separatist droid army appeared out of nowhere, followed by a pretty large clone army as well. It was super confusing and hectic, and the last thing the Republic needed was another election at the time. I remember here in New York City, we went through a very similar situation when the financial crisis hit the city in the 2000s, and Michael Bloomberg got rid of term limits and served a 3rd term. He ended up stepping down afterwards. His 3rd term actually was mired with controversy and kind of ruined the legacy of his first 2 terms. I mean, rarely do politicians do well once they've consolidated power and gotten rid of their opposition. Turns out opposition is what really keeps you honest. And this is what would happen to Sheev Palpatine. You see, when Palpatine refused to step aside at the end of the Clone Wars and give back the emergency powers granted to him, that is when the Republic became a managed democracy. See, the citizens of the Republic could still vote in elections for their elected representatives, but by the end of the Clone Wars, their representatives and their political power had become powerless. And when I mean powerless, I don't mean a Republican living in a blue state or a Democrat living in a red state. I mean, Palpatine was literally killing senators that stood in the way of his policies. At first, he did it covertly, but soon, he was able to control so many senators that he essentially subverted the checks and balances that were designed to keep the Supreme Chancellor from becoming a dictator. And we'll see in the first decade or so of the Galactic Empire, the Imperial Senate is still around, and local elections are still held for those positions, even though it's clear that this was a rubber stamp Congress where you were either loyal to Emperor Palpatine or someone like Mon Mothma, who was deemed too insignificant and naive to be a threat. And so I guess people who create managed democracies are trying to attract people based off of the core principles of democracy, which I think most people like, right? But in reality, the government that is actually behind the scenes is working hard to make sure the electorate doesn't have a significant impact on policy. For instance, as a Helldiver, you, along with every other citizen, have the right to vote for elected officials. But the way that machines actually work in the Helldivers universe is that you answer a series of questions, and then the machine will choose a candidate based on your answers. It's kind of like one of those questionnaires where you figure out which Hogwarts house you would belong to if you took part in the sorting ceremony. That's not how democracies are supposed to work, bro. The justification here for this is that campaigns can be confusing, that voters can be tricked by their candidates, and a voter could potentially elect a candidate that actually is not proper for their viewpoints.
I love democracy.
I mean, this might all be tongue-in-cheek and over the top, but this is like a common perception that political people have of their opposition. It's a very common perception in American politics. That the electorate is stupid and will be swayed by populist sentiment that will lead to short-term windfalls but ultimately harm them. I admit I've even held this view a few times, especially now that social media plays such a huge role in our political discussion. But of course, this is like an elitist way to view your fellow citizens. You should trust your fellow Americans, the people who you share this country with. Democracies at their core are based on mutual trust of your fellow citizens. It's about having courage as a society. You have to believe that the man and woman living next to you will vote in their best interest and be okay with that. It fully embraces the best parts of humanism, that believes that humans have the right and responsibility to shape their own lives and that we are important as individuals and that will not, destroy our society somehow. It also pushes this idea that we are capable of great things together as long as we build a society that is fair, that encourages and allows each individual to reach their own potential. Democracy is actually one of the most optimistic views of humanity, that we do have enough resources, that life doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, that we can all win together. Such optimistic views of humanity are extremely important because, humans, we're a peculiar species. We're the only animal that is driven by our own perception of ourselves. And so our perception of society will really shape how we build our future. We can view the world as a dangerous and hateful place and grow increasingly isolated from one another until we can't even speak the same language and become distrustful as a result. Being optimistic about humanity is really one of the only pathways that can ensure humanity's success and continued existence. It is the only self-fulfilling prophecy that you should be fighting for. A guided democracy is really just the complete opposite of a democracy. It's a cynical view of the world, one that is often shared by authoritarians and dictators who believe that humans inherently are driven by fear, hunger, and other more basic needs and lack the intelligent spark to make the proper decisions for themselves. These people believe that their opinions should be valued more than others, and so naturally they don't take part in the democratic process, and if they do, they will seek every advantage. They will subvert every part of the system they can in order to win. They don't care what damage it does to a democracy or the election system. And it's easy to do this, mind you, because believe it or not, most people in politics, this is gonna be very surprising, are just normal people. And a lot of them are spineless. I mean, they started out just like you and me with a desire to start a career or maybe even serve the populace. But most of these people only do what the system and culture allows them to do. If there's a strong culture of service and responsibility, then your government will be filled with good people. If your country has monetized every aspect of life, including the political system, you're gonna have a lot of average normal people entering that system and agreeing to do some really sketchy stuff because that is what the culture allows. Most people don't ask questions. They don't stick their necks out and question things. They're just happy enough to have a job, to have learned a system and gone through all of the hoops and hurdles, and now they'll do anything to hold on to the political power they've been given by the system. I mean, seriously, just talk to any recently graduated poli-sci major. They'll know everything about the political system and what it takes to win an election, but they'll probably also be okay with some generally icky political maneuvers that are just accepted practice in the political world, but for the uninitiated, for us normal people, would be considered corruption or something even worse. And in their defense, I mean, it is not easy running a large, diverse country with so many different needs. You need rules and regulations, structure, and bureaucracy to make sure that things run smoothly. If you just have 1,000 different voices pulling in 1,000 different ways, you'll never get anything done. And so you need political procedures to speed up the processes and actually get things done. For instance, being a party whip might not seem like the most glamorous thing in the world, but political parties are voted into power based on political goals that they have established, and why wouldn't you have someone marshal your team into shape so that you can win those votes and have no stupid avoidable mistakes? The problem is the larger a nation grows, the more complex and bigger a government usually grows in order to meet all the demands and needs of the populace. And this is why I think Super Earth is run by a managed democracy. It's one thing to try democracy in a small country with a homogeneous population where everyone celebrates the same holiday, listens to the same music, and speaks the same language. I mean, people in that society probably won't pay much attention to politics or even vote in elections at all, because why would they need to? Everyone basically agrees on everything. But if you scale that democracy to a larger nation or a group of nations with very different identities and belief systems, well, you essentially have the EU, or a better example would be the United Nations. The United Nations is oftentimes derided for being a completely useless entity, but it's really not fair in my opinion. It's like calling a handicapped kid out for being, bad at sports or something. It's just messed up. The United Nations mission is simple: to serve as a forum for every country in the world. And so, yeah, Iran gets a seat at the UN Human Rights Council for some reason. We also have China, Russia, and the United States, three bitter rivals serving as permanent members of the Security Council. I mean, you really can't blame the United Nations here, in all honesty. The problem is actually with us, the humans. We're very nationalistic, we're very separated people. We have identities that are based off of different religions, political ideologies. And, the identity of being a human is not something that we've ever really needed to face because we're like the only sentient species on this planet. Now, if there were aliens coming from other planets, maybe our human identity would be, more solidified. Who knows? And I guess that's what the United Nations is there. It's infrastructure for a future Earth that we might never see. Because humanity is too segmented. That can be great because it allows us to preserve our individual cultures and identities, which have been formed in the crucible of human history in the last few thousand years. This is what has allowed us to develop a wide variety of political, economic, and social cultural systems. This variety, this diversity of different systems is what makes humanity so resilient, so that one mistake, one school of thought can't just wipe out the entire human race. But that identity can also lead to stupid things. I mean, how many wars have been fought over religious beliefs, most of which share very similar origin stories and are rooted in the same values? How many wars have been fought over a sense of nationalism or pride for one's group or the fear of others? I mean, some of the most bitter rivalries in the world today have a lot of similarities when it comes to food and art and culture, even language. Whether it's Russians and Ukrainians, Palestinians and Israelis, the Chinese and the Japanese, South and North Koreans. It's almost as if the closer these individuals are, the more triggered they are by the minute differences they recognize in each other. And I guarantee you the people in those groups that I mentioned are going to be upset that I mentioned them in the same sentence as the other groups that they're in a deadly struggle against. You know, if humanity were to adopt a shared identity, maybe internal wars like the ones we used to see between factions will stop. What happens next? Will we be able to preserve all those beautiful things we figured out by ourselves, the various cultures, languages, all these things that make us different? Because that's also really valuable to protect. You know, I don't have an answer for you necessarily. One hopes that eventually humanity will become more enlightened, more rational and pragmatic on how they view the world, less driven by animal instincts, fear, passion, and superstitions. But even when one takes that point of view, the hyper-rationalistic, enlightened view of the world, I mean, they're also forgetting that, like, emotional people, superstitious people, religious people, they are very much important for this world as well. I mean, they're in a lot of ways much more human than the super hyper-rational people are. And so I guess democracy is really not about fighting for things as much as it is about coping with what other people do and being just okay with what your neighbor is doing in the safety of their own home next door to you. It's kind of scary thinking about what they're doing. You know, most government systems are going to be very fluid, and most governments on Earth will try to add democracy labels to their own system, like the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And one government has a guy who always wins 100% of the votes, and the other government can never find 100% of the votes. Even our beloved United States has become increasingly undemocratic because of corporate influence at almost every level of governance. I mean, half of retiring senators and a third of retiring House members in this country register as lobbyists or become corporate consultants and use their government expertise to help corporate interests get maximum profits. You know, while companies like Purdue Pharmaceutical and Boeing literally got away with murder because of the lax regulations in this country for certain industries, we were all too busy worrying about stupid things like identity politics and how our neighbors feel about, like, gender affirmation surgery or illegal immigration. You know, everyone was super angry about Marvel and Star Wars getting woke by adding so many female characters when they didn't see the government printing out trillions of dollars we don't have, so that now everyone feels poor as shit. If I continue elaborating about how insane our political and economic system is right now, I'll probably burst a blood vessel, probably also make a 4-hour video. So instead, George, just show him this. The point is, when you go to the polls, like many Americans do, and feel like your choices don't really matter anymore and you hate the choices that are actually given to you, maybe it's time for you to start questioning just exactly how healthy the democracy you're living in is.